The night Garrett sent 9 armed men into the forest above Copper Creek. Not one came back the way they went in. Tripwires screamed in the darkness. Iron bells rang from 3 directions at once. Horses reared and threw their riders into black pine shadow. From the ridge, one rifle shot split a tree trunk clean at 100 yards. By the time the smoke cleared, Garrett's hired guns weren't fighting anymore. They were running. They hadn't ridden into a mountain man's territory. They had ridden into his trap. Ellie Cross had been building that trap for 6 years. 6 years. Since that man had first put his wife in the ground. But that night is the end of the story. This is the beginning. They said a lot of things about Eli Cross and Copper Creek. They said he had killed 3 men up on Widow's Peak, buried them where nobody would ever find them. They said he lived in a cave because no walls could hold him. They said he talked to wolves at night, and the wolves talked back. None of those things were true. But here is what was true. Eli Cross was 44 years old. He had not spoken 30 words to another human being in 3 months. He wore a buckskin coat, the color of dried creek mud. His beard had not met scissors since the last territorial election. He smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and cold that lives above 8,000 feet. He carried a Hawken rifle, worn smooth from years of use, not polished. Smooth the way a river stone gets smooth from the same hands holding it for years. He came down from Widow's Peak on a Tuesday morning in early October. He needed salt. He needed lamp oil. He needed coffee. Coffee was the one vanity he had never managed to give up. He did not come down for conversation. He came down, conducted his business, and went back up. That had been the arrangement for 6 years. It had suited him perfectly. The main street of Copper Creek ran east to west. A trading post, a livery, a dry goods store, a small church with a cracked bell that had never been replaced, and at the far end, a building with a faded red cross above the door. That building mattered. Eli did not know that yet. He came into town from the north, and the street went quiet, not dramatically. Just a gradual silence, moving from one end to the other. Like a shadow, crossing open ground. A woman pulled her daughter close on the boardwalk. 2 men stopped talking sentence and did not resume. Up shop, Copper took one careful step back from his own doorway. Eli walked through all of it without acknowledgement. He ducked his head and pushed open Walt Fenner's trading post door. Walt looked up from a receipt and nodded, one mountain acknowledging another. Cross, Walt said. Fenner, Eli said. That was the greeting. In its entirety, Eli set 3 cured elk hides on the counter. He pointed to the salt, the lamp oil, the coffee tin on the 3rd shelf. While Walt gathered the items, made the calculation, set the goods out. 4 words passed between them during the entire transaction. Walt said, "Good hide on the big one," Ellie said. "October bull?" Walt nodded. That was all. Ellie shouldered his pack and turned toward the door. He had been in Copper Creek for 11 minutes. It was outside the trading post that he heard it. 2 men talking at the far end of the boardwalk, Pruitt and Holm. Voices unguarded, the way men talk when unobserved. Ellie was 3 steps from the door, heading north, heading home. He heard the name. Samuel Garrett. His hand found the stock of his Hawken rifle. He did not draw it. He did not raise it. He simply held it, just long enough for his knuckles to go white. Then, very deliberately, to loosen again. He stood still and he listened. "Garrett bought the Halverson claim this week," Pruitt said. "And 2 others. He has a surveyor. Legal papers already filed in Denver." "What about the mountain man on Widow's Peak?" Holm asked. "No deed," Pruitt said. "Garrett's lawyer calls him a squatter. Says he'll be dealt with accordingly." Ellie stood on that boardwalk for 5 full seconds. He looked north, toward the tree line, toward the trail, toward home. He breathed in once. He breathed out once. Then he walked. He was almost clear of town when he heard something else. Not men talking. glass breaking, a child's voice, high and sharp with pain. E stopped. He turned. Before we follow Eli Cross across that street, you need to understand something to understand who he was. You need to understand a March morning 6 years earlier. In a mining settlement 2 days south of Copper Creek, a place called Harrow Basin, where the silver had run rich for 3 years, and the men who owned the silver had grown accustomed to the richness. One of those men was Samuel Garrett. The other, for a time, was Eli Cross. They had met the way men met in those years. By chance and proximity, Garrett had the capital. Eli had the knowledge of the land and the stone. For 2 years the partnership worked, real money, the kind neither man had grown up with. Ellie had a wife by then, Clara. Clara Cross was 31 years old, and she laughed too loud for her own comfort. She had a laugh that filled a room and embarrassed her every time. She spent 31 years trying unsuccessfully to learn to laugh quietly. She never managed it. She knew the names of every man who worked in the mine. She knew their children's names. She brought food to the shaft entrance every morning, not just for Eli, for whoever was working that shift. She was, in every sense that mattered, the reason people came through their door. On a Wednesday in January of 1867, Garrett called Eli into the management office. A pine plank table, a coal stove, 2 chairs, a map spread like a confession. "The lower shaft is running hot," Garrett said. "Best ore we've seen. I want to push the crew down another 40 feet by end of month." Ellie had been in that lower shaft 2 days before. He had pressed his hand against the east wall. He had felt the way the stone gave slightly, a subtle flex that meant the weight above was not well supported. "We need more timbering before we push deeper," Eli said. "The east wall is moving." Garrett looked at the map. "The stone is solid enough," he said. He pulled a paper from the desk. He signed it, a work order for the next 30 days. No additional timbering. A deeper push on the lower shaft. Ellie looked at that paper. He said, "Samuel, I'll look at the timbering next month," Garrett said, "after we clear this run." Ellie stood in that room for a long moment. He thought about the east wall and the way it had moved under his hand. He thought about the money, which was real. He thought about the problem, which was also real. He left without signing anything, but he also did not do anything else. He told himself Garrett had more experience with these decisions. He told himself the stone might hold. He told himself he would push harder on the timbering question next week. He told himself a lot of things that Thursday morning. On the following Thursday, the lower shaft collapsed. Eli was on the surface when it happened. He felt it through his boots before he heard it. A deep subterranean shift, like the mountain clearing its throat. Then the sound came up through the earth. A concussive thud that rattled the equipment and sent horses into panic. He was running before the dust cloud reached the shaft entrance. The entrance had partially collapsed. The wooden frame had buckled. Dust poured out in a gray-white cloud that tasted of broken stone. Ellie hit the frame with both hands and pushed. It did not move. He pushed again. He put his shoulder against it and drove with his legs. The frame groaned, shifted, did not open. He hit it with his fists. He hit it until his knuckles were open and bleeding, until the blood was mixing with the dust on the wood, until his hands were leaving red prints on the gray surface. No body came out. 14 men died in that shaft. 2 women. Clara had gone in that morning with food for the day shift. She had done it every morning 2 years. There was no reason Thursday should have been different. Ellie found her in the 3rd hour of digging. She was alive. For a while. What she said to him in those last minutes, that belonged to them alone. He buried her on the hillside above Harrow Basin, in a spot where the morning light came first and stayed longest. Then he walked north. He walked until the air thinned, and human sounds faded entirely behind him. He walked until he found a hollow below a ridge the old trappers called Widow's Peak, where the wind came around the rock face like something trying to say something important. He built a cabin. He lived in it. He did not come down. That is what crossed the street with Eli Cross when he heard the glass break. Not just a man in worn buckskin. 6 years of living with what he had not done. 6 years of a particular cold that had nothing to do with altitude. And now, fresh as a new wound, the name Samuel Garrett. The clinic sat at the far end of the main street behind the way station. It had a faded red cross painted above the door. Not a professional sign, just someone's careful brushwork on raw wood. The paint had weathered to a pale rose that looked stubborn in October. The child was 7 years old. Danny Pruitt, the liveryman's son. He had put his elbow through the clinic's side window with the reliable confidence of a boy who had not yet learned to accurately predict the consequences of his own momentum. His arm was through the glass, up at the middle forearm. The cut was on the outside of the wrist, not arterial, not deep enough to be dangerous, but bleeding with the generous enthusiasm that shallow cuts near the wrist tend to produce, which is to say dramatically. And all at once, Danny was trying very hard not to cry. He was not entirely succeeding. The woman who came through the clinic door moved with unhurried speed, the speed of someone who has responded to emergencies long enough to know. Panic is the first thing that needs treating. She was not tall. She wore a gray dress with the sleeves already rolled to the elbows. Her hair was pinned up in the way of a woman who had done it in 30 seconds. Without a mirror, without thinking about it since, she knelt beside Danny on the boardwalk without hesitation. Her hands were already working before she spoke. One hand cupping his elbow to immobilize it. The other checking the wrist with finger pressed and tested with practiced precision. Danny Pruitt, she said. Her voice was calm. The way still water is calm, not because nothing was happening underneath, but because the surface had learned not to show it. If you keep putting your elbow through my windows, I'm going to have to start charging you for the glass. Danny made a sound that was half sob and half laugh. She had supplies in her apron pocket. Of course she did. Clean cloth already folded. A small glass vial. She worked quickly and carefully, speaking in a low, steady voice. Within 3 minutes the bleeding had slowed. Within 5 it was controlled. She tied the bandage, said 3 quiet words to Danny, gave him a gentle push toward home. She watched him go. Then she stood up, and she looked across the street. Eli was standing at the edge of the boardwalk on the opposite side. He had not moved from where he stopped when he heard the glass break. His pack was on his shoulder. His rifle was in his hand. He had been watching the entire thing. Most people, when they looked at Eli Cross, did one of several things. They found somewhere else to look. They took a step back. They called to their children. Hattie Cole did none of those things. She looked at him the way she had looked at Danny's wrist, with the direct, evaluating attentions of someone whose job required accurate information. Not as a threat, not as a spectacle, as a fact to be assessed. You need something? She said, in the same tone she had used with Danny. No, Eli said. She held his eyes for a moment, the beginning of a calculation she hadn't yet decided to complete. Then she nodded once and went back inside. Ellie stood there a moment longer than he needed to. Across the street, at the door, at the faded red cross. Then he turned and walked toward the north end of town. He passed the way station. He passed the trading post. He passed the last building. The trail north began winding up through the scrub oak into the lower pines. He was 200 yards up the trail when he stopped. He was not sure why he stopped. He stood on the trail in the morning light. And he did something he rarely did. He looked back. The town was visible from here, laid out in its modest east-west line. Buildings casting short shadows in the late morning sun. Smoke from the way station chimney bending southwest in the October wind, and at the far end, just visible, the small building with the faded cross. He could see, from this distance and angle, something he had not noticed at street level. The east-facing slope of the clinic roof had buckled. Not collapsed, not dangerous today, but the shingles on the upper third had lifted and shifted, the way they shift when freeze thaw cycles work, under the flashing another month, maybe 6 weeks, before the first proper snowfall. After that, every hard rain would find its way through. He stood on the trail and looked at that roof for a long time. He had no reason to care about a stranger's roof. He told himself that clearly. Then he turned and walked up the mountain. He did not sleep well that night. He lay on his bunk and looked at the low ceiling. He thought about the name he had heard that morning, Samuel Garrett. He had known this was possible. He had not known, not with certainty, that Garrett would come here specifically, but he had known it was possible. When he had chosen Widow's Peak 6 years ago, he had not chosen it only for solitude. He had chosen it because the ridge geology matched survey reports he had read, reports that indicated silver potential throughout the valley below. Where silver was rumored, men like Garrett eventually followed. He got up. He went to the shelf. He took out a small roll of oilcloth. Inside it, a geological survey map of the Harrow Basin region, dated 1867. 2 signatures in the lower right corner, E. Cross, S. Garrett. He had kept it for 6 years. He had never quite been able to explain why. Now, with Garrett's name fresh in his ears, he thought he was beginning to understand. He put the map back. He put on his work shirt and his boots. He packed his small canvas tool roll, hand adze, block plane, a paper of iron nails. He went into the lean-to and selected a bundle of cedar shingles he had split himself. He loaded the bundle on his back. He went down the mountain in the dark. He had been reading that trail by night for 6 years. The footing was as familiar as the interior of his own cabin. He moved without hesitation, through the pines, through the scrub oak, down to the valley floor. No moon. Stars thick and cold, giving enough light for a man who knew how to use it. He went to the east wall of the clinic. He leaned his shingles against the building and looked up at the roof line. Up close, the damage was worse than it had appeared from the trail. He set his tool roll on the ground. He began to work. He worked in silence, which was easy, because silence was his natural condition. He worked in darkness with the efficiency of a man whose hands had learned to think for themselves. No wasted motions, no second-guessing. He worked until the stars had wheeled significantly west. When he was done, he stood back and looked at what he had done. The repair was solid, not decorative, not visible in any notable way. But the flashing was seated, and the new shingles were nailed tight. That section of roof would hold through a hard winter without complaint. He rolled his tools. On the way down, he had checked his trap line. He had a quarter of freshly dressed elk in his pack. He set the meat on the clinic doorstep, wrapped in clean cloth, tied with rawhide. Then he picked up his tools and went back up the mountain. The second time, he came down with a cord of dry split wood, not 1 load, 3 loads, over 2 days, before first light each time. He stacked it tight against the north wall of the clinic, the north wall where the wind came from. He did not knock. He did not leave a note. The third time, he came with yarrow and willow bark, dried properly, tied correctly, the kind of medicinal stock a frontier doctor burned through fast. He left it on the step beside the door. He was on the upper switchback when he heard a door latch, just the soft click of it opening, then nothing else. No voice, no footsteps. He did not stop. He did not look back. But he was aware, with the precision of 6 years of wilderness living, that he was being listened to as he walked away. The cedar box took 4 evenings. He worked on it by the light of the oil lamp. Cedar, the right kind. aromatic, the variety that repelled moisture as a matter of its basic nature. He worked the joints, by hand dovetails, fitted tight enough to need no glue. He smoothed the interior until it was close, grained, and even. He fitted the lid with a wooden pin hinge that would last as long as the box. He did not decorate it. A decorated box was a gift. This was a tool. He held it in the lamplight on the fourth evening, opened and closed the lid, listened to the fit of it, the slight pressure release, as the lid seated, the clean snap of the hinge, tight enough to keep moisture out, easy enough to open with one hand. He put it in his pack. He went down the mountain. It was the fourth visit to the clinic doorstep. He had the box under his arm and was crouching to set it down, when he became aware, with the abruptness of a man caught off guard, that he was not alone on the doorstep. She was standing in the doorway. She had a shawl over her shoulders. She was holding a lamp turned low. She had been there, from the look of it, for a while. Ellie straightened slowly. He held the box. The lamplight was low and warm between them. The dark was absolute beyond it. The street behind him was entirely empty and entirely quiet. "I know it's you," she said. "The roof, the wood, all of it figured," he said. Her eyes moved from his face to the box and back. "What's that?" she said. He held it out. She took it, turned it in her hands, ran her thumb along the dovetail corner where the joint locked, opened the lid, looked at the interior dimensions. "For your instruments," he said. "Cedar keeps moisture out." She looked at him. "You made this yourself?" "Yes." She ran her thumb along the corner again. "How did you know the dimensions?" she said. "Saw what you had on your shelf through the window," he said. "When you were treating the prudent boy." She held his eyes. "You were watching?" she said. "I was standing on the boardwalk across the street," he said. "I noticed things." A pause. The wind moved through the gap between the clinic and the way station, carrying the smell of pine from the ridge above. "Hattie Cole," she said. Not as an introduction, as an anchor, as the statement of a person, making sure both parties knew exactly where they stood. "Eli Cross," he said. Something crossed her expression, not quite recognition, the beginning of a question she hadn't yet decided whether to ask. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. He followed her inside. The clinic was small. 2 cots along the east wall, a table that served as an examination surface, a shelf of medicines arranged with the careful logic of a limited space put to maximum use. The cedar box he had just handed her was already going onto the shelf, at eye level, between the carbolic acid and the surgical instruments. He noticed that she put it there first. Before anything else, he said nothing about it. She said, "Tell me why you're here." The real reason. He looked at her directly. "Garrett's men have been on my land," he said. "Survey stakes. Weeks of tracks. And today they contaminated my water source." Her expression did not change dramatically. It simply became very still. "He came here too," she said. "4 days ago. Still polite. Said he was interested in the clinic property. He offered to buy me out." "What did you tell him?" Eli asked. "I told him this clinic is the only medical care between here and Salida, and that I have no plans to move it." "How did he take that?" He smiled. She said, "That bothered me more than if he'd argued." Eli nodded slowly. He had seen that smile before, in a management office in a mining settlement, on a winter afternoon, before the world changed. "He won't stop with polite," Eli said. "I know that," she said. She looked at him, the careful, layered look of a woman assembling a picture. "What are you going to do?" she said. He was quiet. "Build something," he said. She waited for more. He did not offer more. She looked at the cedar box on her shelf, at the careful joinery of it. "There are families in this valley afraid to sleep at night," she said slowly. 2 of them have children under 10, and everyone knows Garrett has the territorial administration in his pocket. "I know," Eli said. So when you say you're going to build something, she said, I need to understand what you mean. He looked at her. Not the evaluating look this time. Something more direct, something that cost him more. Something he can't tear down, Eli said. Outside, the wind came off the ridge, sharp, certain. October, reminding the valley it had winter intentions. The light was going thin and gold and long. Hattie Cole stood in her clinic with her arms crossed. She looked at the man who had repaired her roof in the dark, who had left venison on her doorstep without leaving his name, who had built a cedar box with perfect dovetail joints in the evenings by lamplight. She uncrossed her arms. She moved to the examination table and picked up her inventory. I'll be here tomorrow, she said. If you need to talk through what you're planning. Eli took his hat from the examination table. He put it on. He walked to the door. He stopped the yarrow, he said. Brew it as a tea for wound fever. Stronger than the tincture. She looked up from her inventory. I know, she said, but thank you. He nodded once, and he went back up the mountain, from the trail through the old Douglas firs. He could see Copper Creek below, the buildings, the smoke from May Sutton's way station chimney, and, at the far end, the clinic. The window was lit. He had never allowed himself to notice it before. The small square of yellow light at the end of the street, in the building behind the way station, where a woman sat with her inventory and her medicine shelf, doing work that was never finished and never thanked enough. He watched it for a moment. Then he turned and walked up into the dark under the trees. The morning Samuel Garrett called on May Sutton's way station. That was the morning the valley changed. May Sutton had been running the way station since her husband Marcus died of fever the previous year. Alone since then, the building was a relay point for the stage line, a small public room in front, a mail sorting area behind it, 2 guest rooms for travelers breaking the long journey north. Marcus had built it. May had made it work, which was a different skill set entirely. May was 45, part Cherokee on her mother's side, a face weathered by 45 years of paying close attention to things. Sharp eyes, quick mind. She had learned early. In most rooms, people talked freely in front of her. They had decided, for reasons she never corrected, that she wasn't quite paying attention. She was always paying attention. Garrett came in on a Thursday morning, the day after his surveyor finished the first full assessment of the ridge. He was alone, unusual for him. He had been traveling with at least 2 men in every previous appearance. He ordered coffee. He sat by the window. He looked out at the street with the satisfaction of a man who liked what he saw. May poured his coffee. She went back to sorting mail. She did not appear to listen. Fine town, Garrett said, not specifically to her. The way a man talks when he's comfortable talking to empty rooms. Seems all right, May said, without looking up. Good water, good timber. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Interesting geology in the ridge above. Silver-bearing rock formation, running north-south for about 6 miles, from what my surveyor tells me. May sorted a letter into the Halverson slot. She said. The valley could support a significant operation, he said. Still looking out the window. Processing facilities. Workers. A real community. Not a scratch-out-a-living situation. He turned and looked at her with the expression of a man who had just decided something. You've been here a while, Mrs. Sutton. Long enough, May said. Long enough to know this valley deserves better than what it's got. He said it pleasantly, as a simple observation, without any awareness that it might land differently than he intended. May put down the letter she was holding. She looked at him. What's the name of the man on Widow's Peak? She asked. Garrett's expression did not change. Cross, he said. Eli Cross. You know him? I know of him, May said. I know he's been here 6 years. I know nobody's had trouble with him in 6 years. I know every winter the families on the valley floor find things on their doorsteps, things they don't always remember asking for. She picked the letter back up. I know when Jake Morrison's barn burned 2 years ago, it was rebuilt in 4 days. Jake never could explain where all the lumber came from. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Well, he said, the law is clear on the matter of federal land without proper deed. Whatever informal arrangements a person has made with their neighbors, that doesn't constitute legal title. No, May said. It doesn't. She put the letter in the Morrison slot. More coffee? She said. Garrett looked at her for a moment longer. Please, he said. She poured it. He drank it. He left a generous coin on the table, and he went out into the street. May stood at the window and watched him walk toward the land office, flanked now by the 2 men who had been waiting at the hitching post. She watched him for a long time. She noted the way he moved, the way a man moves when he already knows where the furniture is, like he had been in this room before, in his mind many times. Then she put on her coat. She found Hattie at the clinic, cleaning and rewrapping a set of surgical instruments, not on the open shelf. In a cedar box, May sat down in the patient chair without being invited, because she was May. That was how she operated. She looked at the cedar box with the interest of a woman who noticed specific things. She said, "Where did that come from?" she said. Hattie kept working. "Someone left it," she said. May watched her hands. "Along with the venison and the firewood and the herbs on your table last week." Hattie did not answer immediately. "The roof got repaired," she said. "The north wall got stacked with enough wood for 2 winters. Whoever did it knows what yarrow looks like in October and how to dry it properly." She set an instrument in the box, "and they make very good cedar joinery. Eli Cross." May said. Hattie looked up. "Is that a question or a statement?" she said. "Statement," May said. "I've been watching that man come into town twice a year for 4 years. He doesn't spend money on anything he can make himself, and he makes everything himself." She looked at the box again. "That's a mountain man's love language, Hattie. Tools and firewood and proper joinery. He's not sending flowers, because flowers don't help anybody." "I'm aware," Hattie said. "Are you?" May said it without the inflection of a question. Hattie closed the cedar box and set it back on the shelf. "He came inside yesterday," she said. "We talked about—" "Garrett, the survey stakes on his land." "The water source." May was quiet for a moment. "Garrett came to see me this morning," she said. "He's very enthusiastic about the valley's potential. He came here last week," Hattie said. "Offered to buy the clinic, said the valley was going to be developed, said he wanted to ensure adequate medical infrastructure." He smiled the whole time. She paused. "I have been in this territory 4 years, and I have seen that smile on 2 other men. Both of them left a trail of people behind them who lost things they could not get back." May nodded slowly. "What did Cross say he was going to do?" "He said he was going to build something." May considered that. "That could mean a lot of things," she said. "I know," Hattie said. "That's why I told him I'd be here today if he wanted to talk through his plans." She looked at the shelf where the cedar box sat. "I need to understand what kind of man I'm dealing with before I decide how much trouble I'm willing to walk toward." May stood up. She moved to the door. She stopped. "Hattie," she said, "I've known a lot of men in this territory, loud ones and quiet ones, brave ones and careful ones, men who said the right things and then found reasons not to be present when the right things needed doing." She looked back. "In 4 years, I have never once seen Eli Cross say a thing he didn't mean or mean a thing he didn't do. He just doesn't do it loudly." Hattie looked at the cedar box. "I know," she said. May nodded. She went out. 3 days after that conversation, Hattie Cole made a decision. It arrived quietly, the way her important decisions always arrived. Not as a single moment of clarity, but as the natural conclusion of a process of observation that had been running longer than she had consciously allowed. She decided she needed to understand what Samuel Garrett was actually doing, not what he claimed to be doing, not the land development story, which was plausible enough on its surface, what he was actually doing. She started with what she could observe directly. In the 2 weeks since his arrival, Garrett had purchased land from 9 separate owners. The purchases were not random. They ran in a rough arc around the base of Widow's Peak, curving from the southeast to the northwest, connecting the lower valley with the upper ridge access trails. As if someone was drawing a perimeter, she noted that every family who had sold had been dealing with some form of vulnerability. A missed payment, a disputed boundary, a title filed improperly in the territorial records years earlier and never corrected because it had never mattered until now. These vulnerability Pisdenists had been identified with remarkable precision. As if someone had done their research before arriving, she talked to Pete Halverson, 12 years in the valley. Land on the eastern approach to the Widow's Peak Trail. Pete sat across from her in the clinic on a gray November morning. He told her what had happened. Garrett's lawyer came out to the farm. On a Monday, Pete said. Very correct. Very polite. Said there was a question about the boundary survey. On the East 40, said the original survey, from 12 years back might have overlapped with a federal easement. Said he wasn't making accusations, just wanted to bring it to our attention. Before things became complicated, what did you say? Hattie asked. Said I'd look into it. Pete folded his large hands on his knees. Then the next day, Tucker Hayes rode through the north pasture in the early morning. Didn't do anything, just rode through, slow. Looking at things, he paused. My youngest boy is 8 years old. Hattie looked at him. What are you going to do? She said. We're not selling, Pete said. But I want you to know, some of the others are thinking about it. When a man like Garrett makes a legal claim against your land and you can't afford a lawyer, sometimes selling for a fair price looks better than losing everything for nothing. He looked at the clinic window. He knows that. That's why he does it this way. After Pete left, Hattie sat with her inventory and thought. She was building a picture, Garrett at the center, drawing a perimeter around the base of a specific mountain. Legal vulnerabilities being exploited with surgical precision. Tucker Hayes riding slowly through a man's north pasture while his 8-year-old watched. And at the center of everything, a tract of land on the ridge above, occupied without legal deed by a man who had arrived 6 years ago and had been quietly, invisibly building relationships with every family in the valley through acts of anonymous assistance. Hattie looked at the cedar box on her shelf. She thought about timing. Garrett had arrived 2 weeks after the survey stakes appeared on Eli's land, which meant the survey had preceded his arrival, which meant the decision to come here had been made before Garrett saw the valley himself, which meant someone had told him this valley was worth coming to, someone with prior knowledge of the geology, prior knowledge of which land to target. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went to the land office. The land office in Copper Creek was run by a man named Aldridge. 50, methodical, fundamentally decent. He was not entirely comfortable with the recent increase in legal activity. Garrett's presence had generated a great deal of it. Hattie did not ask about Eli Cross's land. She asked, in the roundabout way of a curious woman making conversation, about the history of the Widow's Peak area, how long it had been a known geological feature, whether there had been prior survey activity. Aldridge was happy to talk about geological history. It was a safer subject than current affairs. He told her the first formal survey of the Widow's Peak Ridge had been done in 1867, part of a broader territorial assessment of silver-bearing formations. The survey had been commissioned by a private partnership. "Common practice," he said. The territorial government was happy to let private investors fund the geological work in exchange for prior knowledge of the results. The partnership's name was in the Survey Commission records. Hattie asked to see them. Aldridge found the file. He set it on the counter. She looked at it. The partnership was listed as the Celestial Star Mineral Assessment Company, 2 principals. The first name was Samuel Garrett. The second name was Eli Cross. She stood at the counter for a long moment. Looking at that page, Aldridge was watching her with the expression of a man who had just realized. He had handed someone a more complicated document than he had anticipated. "Thank you," Hattie said. She walked back to the clinic. She sat down. She thought about 6 years of solitude on a mountain. She thought about a man who had come down twice a year for supplies and spoken to nobody. She thought about a geological survey with 2 names on it. She thought about a man who had arrived in this valley with prior knowledge of the ridge. She thought about the way Eli Cross had gone very still. When he heard Samuel Garrett's name on the street, she did not draw a single conclusion. She drew several. They were not all comfortable. That evening, Eli came to the clinic. She had not asked him to come, but she had thought he might. He knocked. He had started knocking after the 4th morning visit. When she opened the door, he stepped inside. He stood the way he always stood, contained, taking up a precise amount of space and not extending beyond it. "You went to the land office," he said. It was not a question. She looked at him. "Aldridge told you?" she said. "No. I saw you go in." He paused. "I was on the ridge above town. I was watching Garrett Surveyor. You came out of the land office with a look on your face that I recognize." "What look is that?" "The look of someone who found something they were looking for and wishes they hadn't." Hattie sat down. She did not invite him to sit, but she did not tell him to leave. "You were partners," she said. "You and Garrett. Celestial Star Mineral Assessment. 1867. Eli stood by the door. The lamplight was between them." "Yes," he said. "He was your partner when the Harrow Basin mine collapsed." A pause. "Yes," he said. She looked at her hands. "Tell me about the survey," she said. "The one you did together. The one that covers this valley." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he moved to the examination table and sat on the edge of it. The first time she had seen him sit in the clinic, he laced his hands in front of him and looked at the floor. "We commissioned the survey in the spring of 1867, he said. Garrett had heard about the silver potential in the Widow's Peak Ridge. He came to me because I had the land knowledge, and he had the capital. We spent 6 weeks doing the assessment together." He paused. "Garrett was smart, genuinely smart. Before Harrow Basin, I respected him." Hattie did not speak. The survey showed strong silver potential along the entire eastern slope of the ridge, Widow's Peak included. But the valley floor properties were the key. Without them, you can't run the processing operation as serious. Mine requires. He looked up. That survey told us exactly which properties in this valley would matter most. It told us which families were most vulnerable, which approach routes were legally accessible. He paused again. That map is the blueprint for what Garrett is doing right now. Hattie felt something settle into place. "He kept a copy," she said. "He kept the original. I kept a copy." Ellie looked at her directly. "My copy is in my cabin. It has both our signatures, and it shows in Garrett's own handwriting geological notes he made during the survey, notes identical to the notes in the Harrow Basin mine report from the same period, notes that prove the geological conditions at Harrow Basin were identified as unstable. He knew them. He had assessed identical conditions elsewhere and marked them in his own hand as high collapse risk. Hattie stared at him. "He knew," she said. "He knew," Eli said. He knew the lower shaft at Harrow Basin had the same geological signature as two other sites. Sites he had already identified as dangerous, he knew it, and he ordered the crew down anyway. The lamp between them burned steadily outside. The wind moved through the gap beside the clinic, carrying the first real cold of what was going to be a hard winter. "That map is he's here," Hattie said. "Not the silver." "Well, the silver too, but primarily the map." "Without the map," Eli said, "the Harrow Basin investigation could never be properly reopened. There were survivors, there were witnesses, but witnesses need documents to anchor their testimony. My copy of that survey is the anchor." He reached into his shirt. He took out a folded piece of oilcloth. He set it on the examination table between them. He did not unfold it. "That's it," he said. She looked at the oilcloth. She looked at him. "You've been carrying this," she said. 6 years, he said. "Every day." She looked at the worn creases, the lines that came from being carried and unfolded and refolded and carried again. "Why did you come here?" she said, to Widow's Peak. "Of all the mountains." He looked at the oilcloth. "Because the ridge geology matched the survey," he said. "Because I knew Garrett still had the original, and because I knew what that original described. I thought if he ever came looking for what that silver promised, he would come here." He looked at her. "I thought I should be here when he did." Hattie sat very still, following each thread to where it led. The way she assembled a diagnosis. "You came here to wait for him," she said. "Yes, and then what?" He was quiet. "I didn't know," he said. "I told myself I did. I told myself I had a plan." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it that was not level at all. 6 years ago, I had a plan that involved confronting Garrett directly. Then 5 years ago, the territorial courts. Then 4 years. Then 3. He looked at his hands. "Every year I came down twice for supplies, and I went back up. And I told myself next year I would be ready to do something about it. But I didn't," she said, not accusing, noting, "but I didn't," he said. "They sat with that, Eli," she said. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." He looked at her. "Do you know what you want to happen here?" she said. "Not what you've planned. Not what you've told yourself. What you actually want." He was quiet for a long time. The lamp burned. The wind moved through the gap outside. "I want him to answer for what he did at Harrow Basin," Eli said, "in a way that stays answered, in a way that means he can't do it to anyone else." He paused. "And I want to stop being the only person who knows what I know. I have been carrying this for 6 years." His voice dropped, just slightly. "It is heavy." Hattie looked at him. She reached across and picked up the folded oilcloth. She held it. "This stays in the cedar box," she said, "on my shelf. That's the safest place in this valley. Nobody goes through a doctor's supplies, not even Garrett's men, unless they want the whole community against them." She set it on the shelf. Behind the cedar box. He looked at the shelf, at the cedar box, at the oilcloth behind it. He nodded once. "All right," he said. The next 2 weeks had a rhythm to them, not a comfortable rhythm, the kind of rhythm that precedes something, the steady escalation of a pressure that has not yet found its release. Eli found the first destroyed trap on a Monday, a good steel jaw trap, not sprung, smashed, deliberately with a rock. He found 2 more by Wednesday. He pulled his entire trap line and reset it further up the slope, on ground that required more effort to reach, more effort than Garrett's men seemed willing to expend. On Friday morning, he came out of the cabin before dawn and smelled smoke. He was moving before the smell fully registered. The fire was on the east slope, dry grass at the base of the lower spruce stand, set low and smart, the way a man sets a fire who understands how mountain fires move. Eli hit it with pine boughs and dirt for 3 hours, working in the cold and the smoke, his eyes streaming, his lungs burning with pine smoke at altitude. He saved the trees. He lost his winter rabbit run, 3 months of careful baiting and trail preparation. Gone in 2 hours of deliberate burning, he stood in the black aftermath and looked at what was left. The message was plain, not, "We will take your land." That message could have been delivered by lawyers. This message was different. This message was, "We can reach you anywhere, and there is nothing you can do about it." On a morning in mid-November, Eli was checking the upper trap line, the ground frozen hard, under a skim of overnight snow. He heard it, not an animal sound, a human sound, the specific crunch of a boot on frozen ground, the sound of a man trying to be quiet and not quite succeeding. Eli did not move immediately. He stayed crouched over the trap. He listened. 2 men, coming from the southeast, along the lower game trail, moving with the lack of confidence of men in terrain they did not know. Footfalls too wide-spaced, compensating for uncertain footing. Valley men, not mountain men. He eased the trap, sprang back into position without the click that would locate him. He straightened. Slowly he moved east to a granite outcropping sitting above the game trail. Clear sight lines in both directions. He moved the way he always moved in the forest, without announcement, without disturbing the ambient sounds of the woods. He reached the outcropping before they reached the section of trail below. He looked down. 2 men. Neither local. Clothes too light for mountain work at this altitude in November. Trail riders, not climbers. One carrying a canvas bag that clinked faintly when it moved. Survey equipment. They stopped below the outcropping. The taller one took out a notebook. He looked up the slope. He looked at the notebook. He looked up again. Should be somewhere along this line, he said. Garrett said the upper access trail runs through here, the other said. Control point for the whole eastern approach. Right. The tall one made a mark. We'll stake it and move on. He wants the whole eastern boundary. By Thursday, they moved on. Ellie watched them go. He waited until the sound of their footsteps faded completely. Then he followed the line they had walked. Checking each place, they had stopped long enough to make a mark. He found 4 survey flags on the upper slope, small metal stakes, red ribbon, driven into the ground at intervals that described the line of what would become, if Garrett had his way, the northern boundary of a new land claim, a claim that ran directly through Eli's upper meadow, cut his primary water access, placed his cabin 300 yards inside territory. Garrett's lawyers would argue it was unclaimed federal land. He pulled all 4 stakes. He carried them back to the cabin. He set them against the woodpile with the others he had already collected. 17 in total now, over 3 weeks of systematic removal. He sat down at his table. He put his hands flat on the wood. He looked at the wall across from him, where the Hawken rifle hung on its pegs above the door, where the Winchester leaned in the corner, where the 3 steel traps hung from the rafter beam. He thought about what those men below the outcropping had said. He wants the whole eastern boundary by Thursday. Thursday was 3 days away. Something was accelerating. The second fire came on a Monday, bigger than the first. Garrett's men set it in 4 places simultaneously. The lower Rabbit Run, the drying meadow above the East Fork, the brush wall on the south approach, and the access trail through the lower spruce stand. 4 fires, all set with intelligent attention to wind direction and fuel density. This was not a warning. This was a demonstration of capability. Eli fought them for 6 hours. He saved what he could. He lost most of what remained of his winter trap preparation. The Rabbit Run gone entirely. Second time, now. The meadow scorched to black. The south approach trail blocked by standing deadfall, too unstable to cross safely. When the last of it was out, Eli stood in the ash. He did something he very rarely did. He sat down. He sat in the ash at the edge of what had been his drying meadow. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at the black ground around him. He was not broken. He was not despairing. He was conducting the internal accounting of a man, assessing what has been spent and what remains. What had been spent? Most of his winter preparation, several weeks of labor, 2 good trap lines. The south approach, what remained? The cabin, structurally intact. The upper spring, still clean. His weapons and his tools. His physical capabilities, and in a cedar box, in a clinic, at the end of the street, below. An oilcloth roll containing the most important document in the current situation. He sat in the ash for 20 minutes. Then he stood up. He went inside. He cleaned the smoke off his hands and face. He packed a small bag. He went down the mountain. He did not go to the clinic first. He went to Pete Halverson's farm, 1/4 mile from the main street, on the eastern valley floor. Petey was in the barn. Ellie went into the barn. Petey looked up. He looked at Eli's coat, still carrying ash from the morning's fires. He looked at Eli's face. The eastern slope? Pete said. Yes, Eli said. Pete set down the harness he was mending. What do you need? He said. Ellie told him. Petty listened without expression. A man who had survived 30 years on the frontier, being careful about which situations he put himself indecisive once he had decided to enter one. He had the look of a man finishing a calculation rather than beginning one. The Morrison boys have been asking me for 2 weeks whether there was something to be done, Petey said. I've been telling them to wait and see. He paused. I think the waiting part is over. I think so too, Eli said. What about the others? Pete said. The Pruitts. Walt Fenner, I'll talk to them, Eli said. Pete nodded. One thing, he said. Ellie waited. My youngest boy asked me last week why the man on the mountain doesn't just leave. Figured it would solve everything. He looked at Eli. I told him some fights follow you. That leaving doesn't end them. It just moves them somewhere else, onto somebody else. He picked up the harness again. He seemed to accept that. Eli looked at the barn floor. He's right to accept it, he said. Pete nodded once. Eli went back out into the November cold. He found Hattie at the clinic. A man he recognized sat across from her. Thomas Morrison, the eldest son, 26. Broad-shouldered, the focused expression of someone waiting to be given something specific to do. When Eli came in, Thomas stood. Mr. Cross, he said. Morrison, Eli said. Thomas looked at Hattie. She gave a small nod. Thomas sat back down. Eli set his bag on the examination table. He opened it. He took out the oilcloth roll, not the one stored behind the cedar box, a second one. From the pack that never left his side, he unrolled it on the table. It was the geological survey. Hattie looked at it. You have 2 copies, she said. I always keep 2 copies of important things, he said. She looked at him. Where was the second one? She said. On me, he said. She absorbed that. Show me, she said. He spread the map fully on the table. Thomas Morrison leaned forward. Ellie traced the line with his finger, the eastern approach, the valley floor properties, the access trails, the ridge geology, with Garrett's handwritten annotations in the margins, the same geological indicators, the same risk notations, the same abbreviated professional shorthand that appeared in the Harrow Basin Mine Report from the same year. This is what he's here for, Eli said. This document. Not the land, or not only the land. This. Thomas Morrison looked at the map. What does it prove, he said, that the man who caused the Harrow Basin mine collapse, 14 men and 2 women dead, did it knowingly, Eli said, that he assessed the identical geological conditions at other sites, identified them correctly as high collapse risk, and then ordered workers into the Harrow Basin lower shaft anyway. He paused. With both our signatures on the same document. There is no argument that he didn't have the knowledge. Thomas looked at the map for a long moment. And if this gets to the territorial court, he said. Then Garrett answers for Harrow Basin, Eli said, and everything he's been building since. The land purchases, the legal manipulation, all of it comes undone, because it all rests on him having the freedom of operation that a conviction removes. Thomas looked at Hattie. Is this true legally? I'm a doctor, not a lawyer, she said. But I sent a letter to an attorney in Denver 2 weeks ago. He wrote back yesterday. She reached into her apron pocket and produced a folded letter. He said a contemporaneous survey document with the principal's signatures, combined with witness testimony from survivors, constitutes sufficient predicate to reopen the Harrow Basin inquiry. Thomas Morrison looked at the map. He looked at Eli. All right, he said. What do we do? They met in May Sutton's back room that evening. Pete Halverson came, Thomas Morrison, and his brother James. Walt Fenner arrived last, his old Sharps rifle leaning against the doorframe, as if it had simply followed him there. Eli spread the map on May's table. He told them everything, not quickly, not dramatically, the way he told Hattie things, completely in order, with all the relevant context and none of the irrelevant. The Celestial Star Survey, Harrow Basin, the collapse, Clara, the 6 years on the mountain, the document, and what it meant. The room was quiet when he finished. Walt Fenner looked at the map. I want to ask you something, Walt said, and I need you to answer me straight. Go ahead, Eli said. Did you come to this valley to bring Garrett to account? Walt said. Or did you come here to get away from what happened and tell yourself someday you'd deal with it? The question landed in the room and stayed there. Ellie looked at Walt. Both, he said. For a long time. Both. Walt nodded slowly. And now, he said. Ellie looked at the map on the table, at the survey lines and the geological annotations, at the 2 signatures in the lower right corner, at 6 years of carrying something that had gotten heavier, not lighter. With every year he did not put it down properly. Now, he said, I want to do what I should have done in that management office. 9 years ago, he paused, I should have walked out of that office and filed the geological report myself, refused to let those workers go down that shaft. He looked at Walt. I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my decision to make. That turned out to be wrong. The room was quiet. I'm not going to make that mistake again, he said. Walt Fenner put his hand on the Sharps, not picking it up, just resting his hand on it. Tell us where to stand, he said. After the others left, Eli and Hattie were alone in the back room. May had excused herself to attend to the last travelers. The stove was burning down. The map was still on the table between them. Hattie was looking at the 2 signatures in the corner. You blamed yourself, she said. It was not a question. Yes, he said. Not just Garrett. No, he said. Not only Garrett. She traced the edge of the map with one finger, without touching the surface. Tell me what you told yourself about that, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I've told myself many things, he said. I've told myself Garrett was the one with the authority and the decision-making power, which was true. I've told myself I raised the concern and was overruled, which was also true. I've told myself there was nothing more I could have, done without resources I didn't have. And what do you tell yourself now? She said. He was quiet for longer. That I could have gone to the Territorial Safety Office the day after that meeting, he said. That I could have refused to be on the site. That I could have told the miners directly what I had told Garrett. He paused. I had enough to act. I chose not to, because acting would have cost me the partnership and the money and the comfortable arrangement I had with a man I thought I understood. Hattie looked at him. And Clara paid for that choice, she said. Yes, he said. The lamp between them burned steadily. Eli, she said, after a long moment, are you doing all of this to make it right for Clara? Or are you doing it because it needs to be done? He met her eyes. I asked myself that same question, he said, on the mountain. after the first fire. What was the answer? He looked at the map. When the fires were burning, he said, I wasn't thinking about Clara. I was thinking about Pete Halverson's boy who can't sleep, about the Morrison widow, about the people who left without saying goodbye. He looked up. She did not look away. Then you have your answer, she said. He reached across the table, not quickly, deliberately, the way he did everything, with the specific intention that comes from a man who does not make gestures he hasn't thought through. He put his hand over hers on the table. She turned her hand over and held his. The stove ticked in the corner outside. The November wind moved through the valley with the cold certainty of a season that had made up its mind. I need to tell you something, he said. Tell me, she said. Whatever happens in the next 2 weeks, I want to be clear about what I am doing here. Not the Garrett part. The other part. He looked at their hands. I am not a man who says things easily. I know that. But I want you to understand what I have been doing since I came down from that mountain. It was not only practical. She squeezed his hand. I know, she said. I know you know, he said. I needed to say it anyway. She looked at him across the table, at the weathered face and the careful eyes and the hands that had been calloused by honest work for as long as he had been alive. After this is over, she said, I would like you to show me the cabin. He looked at her. The cabin, he said. Yes, she said. I've been told the view from Widow's Peak is very good. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. Ellie Cross did not smile in the conventional sense. What he had instead was a quality of stillness that became very slightly less defended. The view is good, he said. Then take me up after this is over, she said. He nodded. They sat with their hands together on the table for a while longer. Then they separated. There was work to discuss, plans to finalize, a timeline that was compressing, but the lamp had burned somewhat lower by the time they got to it. The morning after their conversation in May's back room, Ellie Cross was on the mountain before the valley had fully woken. He checked the trap line on the East Fork, 2 snowshoe hares overnight. He reset the traps, carried the hares back to the cabin, cleaned them, hung them in the cold lean-to. He ate breakfast. He worked on a section of the cabin's north wall, re-chinking gaps where the moss had dried out, and the cold was beginning to find its way through. The work was methodical and satisfying him, the way all work is satisfying when the hands know exactly what to do, and the mind is free to move where it wants. His mind moved, as it had been moving for days, to Copper Creek, not to Garrett, not to the survey stakes or the contaminated creeker, the legal complications Pruitt and Holm had described, to the clinic at the end of the street, to the woman who had looked at him without flinching, who had accepted his non-answer, with the patience of someone who had learned the difference between a man who had to say and a man who was choosing what to say carefully. He worked through the morning on the cabin wall. In the afternoon he went into the forest, not to his trap line, into the older growth on the steep north-facing slope below the main ridge, where the undergrowth was dense and the ground stayed damp enough even in October for the medicinal plants to persist. He moved through that forest the way he moved through everything, without announcement, without hurry, without wasted motion. He gathered yarrow. He gathered willow bark, stripping it carefully from the secondary branches of the older treason, a way that left the tree intact. He found a stand of dried goldenrod, good for respiratory complaints, a patch of elderberry past its prime for fresh use, but that would yield well if dried properly. He carried everything back to the cabin and spread it on the drying rack above the stove. He told himself he was restocking his own supplies. He knew he was lying. He sat at the table in the late afternoon, and he looked at the shelf across from him. The Hawken on its peg, the Winchester in the corner, the 3 steel traps on the rafter beam, and on the small shelf to the left of the door, the row of carved wooden figures he had made over 6 years, an elk, a bear, 2 deer, a great horned owl, a mountain lion in the low crouch of an animal about to move, a rabbit mid-leap. He looked at the end of the row, the space at the end where the next thing would go. He pulled a block of mountain oak from the wood pile. He sat down. He picked up his knife. He began to work. He did not work on an animal. He worked on a figure, a person. He had not carved a person before, not in 6 years, not since he had come up to this mountain. He worked slowly, more slowly than he worked on the animals, because the animals he knew from memory and from sight and the particular intimacy of a hunter's long observation. A person was different. A person required something else. He worked until the lamp oil burned low. He set the unfinished figure on the shelf at the end of the row. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went to bed. The morning Samuel Garrett made his second round of land purchases. May Sutton counted 7 separate visits, the land office, the trading post, and 3 private properties before the noon bell. He moved through the valley with the systematic efficiency of a man who had done this before. Always polite, always reasonable, always presenting the specific combination of legal language and personal warmth that made people feel they were being offered something rather than having something taken. His method was precise. Find the person with the most to lose. Establish the legal complication, real or manufactured. Introduce the possibility of an extended, expensive court process that the person could not afford. Then offer resolution. Generous, reasonable. Final. The families who sold in that second week were not weak people. They were people who had done the math and arrived at a conclusion that Garrett had spent considerable effort to make appear inevitable. The Morrison widow was not among them. She had 3 grown sons and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent 30 years building something on hard ground and had not survived that Prosesto handed to a man with soft hands and a pleasant smile. When Garrett's lawyer visited her farm, she met him at the gate with a look that communicated everything necessary without a single word being spoken. He left without dismounting. Pete Halverson was not among them either, but Pete had begun sleeping in the main room of his house with a lamp burning and his rifle close to hand. His youngest boy had stopped asking questions. Children on the frontier learned early to read the quality of adult silences. Tucker Hayes was the instrument of the secondary pressure. He did not threaten directly. He did not need to. He appeared at the edge of a man's property, on the road outside a family's farm, in the main street of Copper Creek, standing at the far and looking at something specific with the flat, patient attention of a man who was being paid to look. The morning Tucker Hayes stood outside the clinic for the second time that week, Hattie Cole came to the door and looked back at him. She held his gaze for a long moment. He did not move. She did not move. The street between them was empty in the particular way of a street where people had decided to be somewhere else. Then Tucker Hayes put 2 fingers to his hat brim, a gesture that was technically civil and was not civil at all, and walked away. Hattie watched him go. She went back inside. She stood at her examination table, and she was very still for a moment. Then she went back to work, because going back to work was what she did when there was nothing else to do, and doing nothing was not acceptable. Garrett came to the cabin on a Wednesday morning, 11 days before the final confrontation. He came with Tucker Hayes and one other man, a younger one, broad across the shoulders, who wore his gun in a way that was meant to be noticed. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of November morning where the sky is hard blue and the light has no warmth in it at all, only brightness. Eli heard them on the lower trail 40 minutes before they arrived. He had been splitting wood in the clearing in front of the cabin. He kept splitting wood. When they came around the last bend in the trail and into the clearing, he set the axe down. He straightened. He looked at them. Garrett dismounted with the ease of a man accustomed to being welcome. He looked around the clearing, at the cabin, at the lean-to, at the neat stacks of firewood, at the garden of equipment that spoke of a man who had been in one place long enough to accumulate the domestic architecture of sustained habitation. "Mr. Cross," Garrett said. He smiled. The same smile. Warm, present, attentive, not quite, connected to his eyes. Remarkable place. "You've made a real home here." Eli said nothing. Garrett came forward with his hand extended. Eli looked at the hand. He let it stay extended for 3 seconds. Then he looked back at Garrett's face. Garrett lowered his hand without embarrassment. He had the social poise of a man who had been refused handshakes before and had learned to treat it as interesting rather than insulting. "I'll be direct," Garrett said. "I have legal interest in the land surrounding this ridge. My surveyor has completed his assessment. There are questions about the original filing on this parcel that I think if we sat down together like reasonable men, we could resolve to both our benefit." "There are no questions about the filing," Eli said. "I have a copy of the territorial survey. The boundary is clear." Territorial surveys can have errors," Garrett said pleasantly. "Clerks can be careless. Records get misfiled. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm simply saying in my experience, these situations are always better resolved through conversation than courts." Tucker Hayes had positioned himself to Eli's left, at a distance that was careful. Not threatening available. Eli did not look at Tucker. He looked at Garrett. "You ran the Harrow Basin mine," Eli said. "Spring of 1867, you ordered the lower shaft crew into a section you knew was inadequately supported." Something shifted in Garrett's face. Not on the surface. The surface stayed professional, composed, attentive. But somewhere behind the surface, a door closed. "That was a tragedy," Garrett said. His voice was even. "A terrible accident. These things happen in mining operations." 14 men died," Eli said. 2 women. Garrett was quiet. "My wife was one of the women," Eli said, not loud, not heated, not as a weapon, just said. Like setting a stone on the ground between 2 people, something that could not be moved and did not need to announce itself. For the first time in any conversation, the smile went away. Garrett stood in the clearing in the hard November light. And he looked at Eli Crosswith, the first expression Eli had ever seen on his face that was entirely unmanaged. It was not remorse. It was calculation. "I'm very sorry for your loss," Garrett said finally. His voice was careful now, measured. "But that loss, as painful as it was, doesn't have bearing on the current situation. This is a legal matter. Get off my mountain," Eli said. He picked up the axe, not threateningly. He picked it up the way he would pick it up if Garrett were not standing there. Because there was wood to split. The morning was getting older, and the axe was reason not to pick it up. The younger man behind Garrett moved his hand. Tucker Hayes looked at the younger man and made a very small motion with his head. The younger man's hand stopped. Tucker had been watching Eli since they arrived, not with dead-eyed surveillance, with something different, the assessment of a man measuring an opponent rather than simply monitoring a target. Garrett studied Eli for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. He rode back down the trail. The younger man followed immediately. Tucker Hayes was the last to turn before he did. He looked at the cabin, at the lean-to, at the traps hanging from the rafter, being visible through the open lean-to door. He looked at those traps the way a man looks at something familiar from a different context, the way you look at a tool you have not held in years, but whose weight your hands still remember. Then he turned and rode down after the others. Eli stood in the clearing and listened until the sound of their horses faded completely. Then he went back to splitting wood. He split wood for 2 hours without stopping. When he was done, he went inside, and he sat at the table, and he looked at the wall for a long time. Then he put on his coat and he went down to Copper Creek, not because he had planned to, because the quiet inside the cabin had a quality he did not trust. The way station was warm. May had the stove going. 2 travelers nursing coffee at the front table. The smell of wood smoke and coffee, and the specific human smell of a heated room in November, a kind of sensory ambush for a man who spent his days in cold air and pine. He stood in the doorway for a moment. May looked up from the mail counter. She read his face the way she read everything. "Hattie's in the back," she said. "Go through." The back room was May's own space. A table, 3 chairs, a window facing the hillside behind the building. Hattie was there with a cup of tea and a book she was not reading. She looked up when Eli came in. She set the book down. He sat across from her. He put his hands on the table. He looked at them. "He came to the cabin this morning," he said. "I know," she said. "May saw them on the road." "I told him about Clara," he said. "She waited. I don't know why," he said. "It wasn't strategic. It wasn't planned. He was standing there in my clearing with his hand out and his smile, and—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I just told him." Hattie was quiet for a moment. "What happened when you told him?" she said. The smile stopped, Eli said, for about 3 seconds. Then it came back, but different, tighter. She nodded slowly. "He's recalculating," she said. "He came up there expecting a straightforward land negotiation with a man who didn't know who he was dealing with. Now he knows you know. That changes his timeline. He'll move faster," Eli said. "Yes." He looked at the window, at the gray hillside behind the way station. "There's something else," he said. "She waited, Tucker Hayes," he said. "When he was leaving, he looked at my trap lean-to. At the traps on the rafter beam." He paused. He looked at them like he knew what they were, not like someone who has seen traps before in a general way, like someone who has used them. Hattie considered that. "What does that mean?" she said. "Men who have spent time on a mountain. They look at things a certain way," he said. "They look at the equipment the way you look at a language you used to speak." He looked at his hands again. "Tucker Hayes has spent time on a mountain, and he was at Harrow Basin. I know he was. I remember seeing him in the lower bunkhausen the first year of the operation. He was a miner before he was Garrett's man." Hattie sat with that. "He survived the collapse," she said. "I think so," Eli said. She looked at the table between them. "Then he knows what Garrett ordered," she said. "He was there." "Yes," Eli said. They sat with the weight of that outside. Someone crossed the yard behind the way station, boots loud on the frozen ground. Then quiet. "Again, Eli," Hattie said. He looked at her. "You have been carrying the right thing to end this for 6 years," she said. "Not the map alone, but the map plus the letter you wrote Tucker Hayes, if Tucker Hayes would testify." "He won't," Eli said. "He works for Garrett." "He works for Garrett now," she said. "Men change their positions when the cost of their current position becomes clear to them." She paused. "When this is over, one way or another, Tucker Hayes is either going to be charged as an accessory to what happened at Harrow Basin, or he is going to be a witness for the people Garrett harmed. Those are his options." She looked at him steadily. "Does he know that?" Ellie looked at her. He had been thinking about Tucker Hayes as an obstacle. She was thinking about Tucker Hayes as a variable. The difference between those two things was considerable. "No," he said. "He doesn't know that." "Then someone should tell him," she said, "before the confrontation." "Not after." Ellie was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking ahead," he said. "I'm a doctor," she said. "I always think about what happens after." He looked at her. at the woman across the table from him in May Sutton's back room, with her tea going cold and her unread book pushed to the side, who had taken his geological survey mapping his 6 years of accumulated careful thinking, and in 3 weeks had already begun to see angles he had not seen. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" she said. "For coming down here and bringing this with me," he said. "You were running a clinic, doing something real and useful, and I've—" He stopped. "This is my fight. It became yours because of geography. That's not fair." Hattie looked at him. "For a long moment, Eli," she said. "Samuel Garrett has been systematically dismantling this community for 6 weeks. He has frightened people. I have been caring for 4 years. He has threatened children and widows and old men." She paused. "This stopped being only your fight before you came down from that mountain." She picked up her teacup. "So stop apologizing and start thinking about what we do next." He looked at her. He said, "May called it right, didn't she?" Hattie set the cup down carefully. "Called what right?" she said. "She said it wasn't kindness," he said. "What I was doing. The roof and the firewood and the rest of it." He said it the way he said most things. Not decorated, not softened. She said it was courting, the slow, patient kind. Hattie looked at the table. "May has opinions," she said. "May is correct," Eli said. He was not looking at the table. She looked up. The back room of the way station was very quiet. The travelers' voices from the front room were a distant murmur. The stove in the corner ticked. Outside, the November wind moved through the yard. "I know," she said. "Not agreement and not refusal. Just, I know." It was for both of them sufficient. "What do we do next?" Eli said. Hattie set both palms on the table. "I need to speak to Tucker Hayes," she said. "Before Garrett makes his move. Not about Garrett. About what comes after Garrett. About what his choices actually are." She looked at Eli. "Can you find out where he goes alone?" Ellie thought about it. "He rides the South Road on Tuesday mornings," he said. "Checks the approach from the southern pasture. Alone. Early. One of Garrett's habits. Perimeter checks before the town wakes. Tucker does the southern route." "How do you know that?" Hattie said. "I've been watching them for 2 weeks," Eli said. She nodded. "Tuesday morning," she said. "Tuesday morning," he said. She stood up. She looked at the window, at the dark hillside behind the way station. "Eli," she said. He waited. "When you go back up tonight—" She stopped, started again. "The light in your cabin window. I can see it from the clinic. When I work late." He looked at her. "I know you can," he said. She turned away from the window. She looked at him directly. "Don't let it go out early," she said. It was a very simple thing to say. It was not a simple thing to mean. He held her gaze. "It won't," he said. On Tuesday morning, Hattie Cole was waiting on the south Rhoda, quarter-mile from the main street, before the town was fully awake. She stood at the edge of the road with her medical bag over one shoulder and the particular composure of a woman who had decided on a course of action and was not going to be dissuaded by second thoughts. Tucker Hayes came around the bend at a slow walk. He saw her. He pulled his horse to a stop. He looked at her for a moment with his pale eyes, his professionally expressionless face. "Mrs. Cole," he said. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "You're out early," he said. "I often am," she said. "I'd like to speak with you." He looked at the road ahead. He looked at the road behind. He looked at her again. "I'm on a schedule," he said. "This won't take long," she said, "and it concerns something that affects your schedule considerably." A pause. He dismounted. She did not waste his time with preamble. She told him what she knew about Harrow Basin, about the geological survey, about the document with 2 signatures, about the attorney in Denver, and what the attorney had said about the strength of the evidence. Tucker Hayes stood with his horse's reins in his hand, and he listened with the specific quality of attention, of a man who had been waiting for a particular conversation for a long time and was not surprised that it had finally arrived. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. "What do you want from me?" he said. "A written statement," she said, "describing what you saw at Harrow Basin, what you heard in the management office, what you know about what Garrett ordered and why, and in exchange," he said, "your testimony as a witness for the prosecution," she said, "not as a defendant." He looked at the road. He looked at the early morning light on the ridge above Copper Creek. "I've been working for Garrett for four years," he said. "I know what you've been doing for Garrett." "Hattie," she said, "I'm not interested in the past 4 years. I'm interested in the winter of 1867. Were you in the Harrow Basin lower bunkhouse in the weeks before the collapse?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Did you hear the conversation between Garrett and Cross about the timbering on the lower shaft?" Another pause. "I was outside the office window," he said. The window was open. It was January, Hattie said. "The stove was running hot," he said. "They opened it for air." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Hayes," she said. 14 men went into that shaft the morning after that conversation. "You know what happened to them?" he said. "Nothing." "You have been carrying that for 9 years," she said. "I imagine it has gotten heavier." His jaw tightened fractionally, the only movement on an otherwise still face. "Tuesday next week," she said. Come to the clinic in the evening. I'll have paper and ink ready." She turned to go. "Mrs. Cole," he said. She stopped. "Cross know you're doing this?" he said. "No," she said. "He knows I was going to talk to you. He doesn't know I was going to offer you what I offered you." She paused. "That was my decision." "Why?" Hayes said. She considered the question. "Because the man who was in that office 9 years ago made a choice that cost people their lives," she said. "He has been trying to make it right ever since. You were outside that window. You didn't make a choice. You just didn't speak." She looked at him. "That's a different weight, and it doesn't have to be yours forever." She left him on the south road with his horse in the early morning light at 9 years of a particular silence that was finally ready to be broken. 2 days later, Eli disappeared from the cabin, not from the mountain. He was on the mountain the entire time. But he was not in the cabin. He was not on the regular trap lines. He was walking every inch of the approach routes to Copper Creek, the eastern trail, the main trail, the 2 secondary paths through the spruce stands on the south slope. He was walking them the way he had walked them for 6 years, with the specific attention of a man whose safety had depended on knowing this ground, the dark, in bad weather, in every season and condition. He was looking at it differently now, not as the terrain he moved through, as the terrain that would be moved through by men who did not know it. He set the first wire on the eastern trail, 20 yards below the upper switchback, tripwire, ankle height for a horse, knee height for a man, stretched across the narrowest section of the trail, where 2 boulders created a natural funnel, attached at both ends to bundles of tin cans, empty cans, 5 or 6 in each bundle, to produce a sound on a quiet night that would carry a quarter-mile in still air. He was not trying to stop horses. He was trying to know where they were. The second wire went on the main trail, 50 yards from the valley floor, at a section where the trail curved a rider could not see more than 10 yards ahead. This one he attached to a wooden frame hung in the spruce branches above. A light frame, nothing elaborate, but enough to produce a crack and a rustle when disturbed that would be identifiable as unnatural to any ear paying attention. The bells were his best work, 6 of them, small iron bells he had cast himself over 2 winters, originally intended as signals for the outer reaches of his trap line. Each bell, the size of a man's fist, hung on a length of braided wire, capable of producing a clear tone in a light breeze. He placed them in the trees. 3 along the eastern approach, 1 on the main trail. 2 in the spruce stand on the south slope. He placed them at different heights, oriented slightly differently to the prevailing wind, so they would not ring simultaneously. They would ring in sequence, irregularly, the way natural sounds moved through a forest, almost but not quite like wind, almost but not quite like nothing, enough to make a man stop, enough to make a man look up, enough to give a man on the ridge above a precise map of where, in the dark forest, other men were standing. He worked through the first day and into the second. On the second evening, he went to each of the 6 families he had spoken to. Not the same visit as before, not the same message. This time, specific instructions, specific positions, specific signals. He went to Walt Fenner last. Walt was closing the trading post for the night. He looked at Eli in the lamplight. "It's soon," Walt said. "Tomorrow or the next day," Eli said. Walt looked at the sharps leaning against the counter. "I haven't used that in 11 years, he said. "I know," Eli said. "My eyes aren't what they were," Walt said. "I'm not asking you to shoot," Eli said. "I'm asking you to be present. There's a difference." Walt picked up the sharps. He turned it over in his hands. "You know something?" he said. "I've been watching. You come into this valley twice a year for 4 years every time. You came in looking like a man walking through a place that had nothing to do with him. You bought your supplies. You left. You didn't look at anybody." He paused. "But things got done around here that nobody could explain. Fences got mended. Roofs got fixed, and nobody ever claimed it. Because nobody ever needed to be thanked, apparently." He set the sharps down on the counter. "I'm going to ask you something, and you don't have to answer." "Ask," Eli said. "All those years," Walt said. "All those things you did without anybody knowing. Was that because you wanted to help, or was it because it's kept you connected to something you were afraid to connect to directly?" Eli stood in the lamplight of the trading post. He thought about the specific quality of satisfaction had felt in those early years. Leaving firewood and embeat and prepared fence lines in the dark, climbing back up to the mountain, the warmth of it, the way it had felt like belonging to something at a safe distance. "Both," he said. Walt picked up the sharps again. "Both," he said. "That's what I thought." He looked at Eli. "You done with the distance part?" Eli looked at the door. "Yes," he said. Walt nodded. "Good," he said. "Then I'll see you in the East Pines, midnight. The night after next." Eli went out into the November dark. He walked back up the trail through the cathedral, through the old firs with their clean, high trunks, through the cold and the dark hands, the smell of pine and frozen earth. He stopped at the top of the last switchback. He looked north, not at the mountain, at the ridge above the mountain, where the sky was very dark and very clear, and the stars were the particular stars of altitude, brighter and more numerous than valley stars, as if the thin air allowed you to see further in every direction. He stood there for a long moment. He thought about Clara, about the hillside above Harrow Basin, about the stone he had set. And the words, he had the cold air of a March afternoon 6 years ago. He thought about what it meant to keep a promise, not just the version of the promise that required him to stand in front of Garrett with a rifle, but the full version, the one that meant making sure it could not happen again. That the document reached the right hands, that the witnesses were heard, that the families who had lost someone had their loss acknowledged by something more substantial than a small settlement and a lawyer's letter. He thought about Hattie Cole saying, "After this is over, take me up to the cabin." He thought about what it would mean to have that. Someone to bring up the trail. Someone who would stand at the east-facing window in the morning and let the light in. He looked at the stars for a long time. Then he went inside. He built up the fire. He sat at the table. He took out a clean sheet of paper. He began to write. A second letter, not to a court, not to the territorial authority, but to the attorney in Denver. That Hattie had already been in contact with. He described the document. He described its location. He described the chain of custody. He wrote what the document showed and what the witness testimony could establish, Tucker Hayes included. He wrote that name deliberately. He sealed the letter. He addressed it. He put it in his pack. In the morning, May would put it on the stage. Whatever happened over the next 2 days, the letter would go. That was one thing he could make certain of regardless of the outcome. He looked around the cabin, at the low ceiling, and the iron stove and the Hawken on its pegs above the door, at the Winchester in the corner, at the 3 steel traps hanging from the rafter beam, and at the shelf on the left side of the door, at the row of carved wooden figures, the elk, the bear, the deer, the owl, the mountain lion, the rabbit, and at the end of the row, the unfinished figure he had started 3 days ago. He picked it up. He sat down. He picked up his knife. He worked in the lamplight until the figure was finished. He held it up. A woman, standing straight, a bag over one shoulder, the posture of someone who moved with deliberate economy. He set it at the end of the row. He looked at the row of figures, all the animals, and at the end, a person, the first person he had carved in 6 years. He blew out the lamp. He lay down on the bunk. Outside, the November wind came around the ridge, and in the east, pines below Widow's Peak, the iron bells rang softly in the dark wind. Not warning, not yet, just waiting, the way everything worth having makes you wait. They came at midnight, 9 men. Riding in from the eastern approach, the route Garrett had chosen, because his surveyor had identified it as the most direct line between the valley floor and the upper cabin. The most direct line was correct. It was also the line Eli had been walking for 2 days, setting wire and hanging iron in the dark spaces between the trees. The night was clear and cold and moonless. The stars gave enough light to ride by on open ground. In the forest, they gave nothing. The lead rider was a professional, from the way he sat his horse, relaxed and alert in equal measure. He had ridden into Copper Creek 4 days ago, a horse that cost more than most settlers made in a year. He had not spoken to anyone. He had not needed to. His presence was its own communication. Behind him came 8 more. Tucker Hayes was not among them. That was the first thing Eli noted from his position on the ridge above the eastern trail, watching through the darkness, with the patience of a man who had spent 6 years, learning to see in conditions like this. Tucker was not in that group. Tucker had ridden out of Copper Creek in the early afternoon, heading south on the main road. He had not returned. Ellie filed that away. The riders entered the forest. The forest received them. For approximately 40 seconds, as nothing happened, the horses moved forward on the trail, with the cautious placing of feet that horses use in unfamiliar dark terrain. The men on their backs held their reins and their silence, and believed they were making good progress. Then the lead horse hit the first wire. The wire caught it at knee height. The horse lurched sideways, front legs crossing. Wald thrown against the right-hand boulder that formed one side of the natural funnel. The tin cans exploded, not with the sound of weapons, with the screaming metallic clatter of a dozen empty cans shaken violently in the absolute silence of a November midnight forest. The sound bounced off the rock face above the trail. It came back doubled and triple and directionally confused, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The lead horse reared. The rider was good. He stayed on, but the 2 horses directly behind had no warning. The sound hit them before they had registered the stumble ahead. Both animals shied hard to their respective sides. One of them put its rider into a low spruce branch with enough force to unhorse him cleanly. The man hit the frozen ground. He got up. He was not hurt badly, but he was no longer on his horse, and his horse was 20 feet back down the trail, and moving further from the east. The first iron bell rang, one clear tone, carrying in the cold air with the specific resonance of cast iron, neither too brief nor sustained, hanging in the darkness, long enough to be heard and processed and feared, then silence. Then from the south, a second bell, low for slightly different pitch. Silence. Then from directly above, the wooden frame in the spruce branches, disturbed by a rope. Eli was holding from the ridge. A crack and a rustle, and a sound like something large is shifting its weight in the dark above the trail. One of the men said, very quietly, "What is that?" It was not quite a question. The professional in the lead had gotten his horse settled. He was looking up the trail, then back at his men, then at the darkness above the tree line. He was doing the calculation that professionals do, assessing what he knew against what he was experiencing, weighing the deviation from plan. The calculation was not going well. "Keep moving," he said. They kept moving. The second wire was on a section of trail that curved sharply to the left, around a granite outcropping. A rider could not see it coming until he was 4 feet from it. By the time the lead horse registered the obstruction, there was no room to stop. The wire caught the horse at chest height. The horse stumbled, went to its knees. The rider came over its neck and landed in the frozen brush on the left side of the trail with the specific sound of a large man arriving on hard ground. The tin can bundle detonated, and from 3 directions simultaneously, all 3 eastern bells rang, not in unison, in rapid sequence, 1, 2, 3, each from a different point in the dark above and around the trail, each producing its single clear iron note, and then going silent, so that the sound seemed to move through the forest away. A voice moves when a speaker turns his head. 3 of Garrett's 9 men had already decided. They did not announce their decision. They simply turned their horses and rode back the way they had come, quickly, in the direction of open ground and the valley, floor in the kind of terrain where a man could see what was coming. 3 became 6. The remaining 6 held. The professional was still in the lead. He had not spooked. He was working with what he had. 6 men, disrupted formation, unknown opposition, terrain that was clearly prepared against them. He made the correct assessment. This was an ambush. He had ridden into it. The intelligent response was withdrawal and reassessment. He opened his mouth to give the order. That was when the lights came on. They came from the tree line on both sides of the trail. Not many lights, 8 lanterns, spread through the pine-sen, the east and west edges of the approach, each held by a person who stepped out of the trees, sat the same moment, which created the impression in the dark, with the bells still resonating, of a perimeter, of a prepared position that extended further than it actually did. Walt Fenner was the westernmost light, holding his lantern in one hand, his sharps in the other, with the ease of a man reacquainting himself with a familiar posture. Pet Halverson held the easternmost, standing at the shoulder of a spruce tree with his rifle and his large unhurried still niece. Thomas and James Morrison flanked. Fiwan flanked the trail 20 yards further down, between the retreating riders and the valley floor. 7 others filled the spaces between. Farmers, a blacksmith, 2 men whose names Eli had learned only in the past week. They did not advance. They did not shout or threaten. They simply stood. In the lantern light, their faces were clear. These were not professional fighters. These were people who had gotten out of bed and dressed in the cold and walked up a mountain trail in the November. Dark because they had decided that some things required their presence. The 6 remaining riders looked at the lights. They looked at the trail. behind them, which was blocked by the Morrison brothers, which was blocked. They looked at the darkness above from which the iron bells had spoken. The professional in the lead was still calculating. He was a good calculator. His calculation was now 6 men against a perimeter of unknown size, in rigged terrain, at night with retreat obstructed. He set his rifle across his saddle horn, the gesture of a professional concluding an engagement. 2 of his men followed the gesture immediately. 3 more followed those 2. The 6th sat still for a moment. Pete Halverson's lantern moved slightly, illuminating Pete's face from below, large, patient, utterly unbothered. The 6th man set his rifle across his saddle horn. "We're riding out," the professional said. "South Road." "Thomas," Morrison said, from behind them. All the way through, the professional nodded once. He rode south. His 5 men followed. Thomas and James Morrison stepped as Citado let them pass. They watched them go. They did not take their eyes off them until the sound of the horses faded completely. Into the valley dark, in the mining camp at Miller's Creek, a mile east of the main trail, things were different. Garrett had set up at the old camp because it gave him a position off the main approach. Clear sight lines to the eastern trail. A defensible structure in the form of the largest remaining shack. He had 4 men with him. Tucker Hayes was supposed to be among them. Tucker Hayes was not there. Garrett did not know where Tucker Hayes was. That was the second unexpected variable of the evening. After the signal from the eastern trail, 3 bells in sequence, the prearranged signal from the professional that the approach had been compromised. He had received that signal. He had adjusted his position. He had waited. He was still waiting when Hattie Cole walked out of the shackin' her own 2 feet. The man Garrett had assigned to watch Hattie was named Corbin, 28. Reliable. In the way that young men who are trying to prove themselves are reliable, which is to say completely, until the moment something outside their experience occurs. What occurred outside Corbin's experience was Hattie Cole specifically. Hattie Cole's medical bag, which she had been carrying when Garrett's men collected her from the clinic 3 hours earlier. No one had thought to remove it. It was a medical bag. She was a doctor. The possibility that a frontier doctor might carry, among her standard supplies, a quantity of ether sufficient for minor surgical procedures had not entered Corbin's threat assessment. Hattie had spent 4 years treating injuries and illnesses in an unincorporated territory. She had delivered babies in the back of wagons, set bones by lamplight, stitched wounds with whatever thread was available. She was not, by any conventional measure, a woman who needed rescuing. She had assessed Corbin within the first 20 minutes of his watch. She had noted his position, his habits, the specific quality of his alertness, the degree to which his attention wandered toward the activity outside the shack, and away from the quiet woman sitting against the interior wall, with her hands folded in her lap. She had waited. When Corbin's attention was fully outside, drawn by the sound of the professional signal bells in the distance, she moved. The ether-soaked cloth was in her hand before he turned back. She was precise about it. Clinical, she had administered anesthesia in circumstances more demanding than this. She brought to the process of same focused efficiency she brought to everything medical. Corbin sat down. Hattie stepped over him carefully. She pushed the shack door open and walked out into the November night. Garrett was standing 30 feet from the shack door, looking toward the eastern approach. He heard the door. He turned. He looked at Hattie Cole standing in the doorway of the shack, with her medical bag over her shoulder and her expression entirely composed. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Where is Corbin?" "Sleeping," Hattie said. "He'll be fine in a few hours." Garrett looked at the remaining 3 men. They were looking at Hattie with the specific uncertainty of men who had been given clear instructions about one scenario. "We're now in a different scenario, entirely, Mrs. Cole," Garrett said, his voice controlled. "Professional, I would ask you to go back inside." "I'm a doctor." Hattie said, "I don't go back inside when there are people who may need my services outside." She walked away from the shack, not toward Garrett, toward the eastern edge of the clearing where the tree line was closest. Garrett watched her. He made a decision not to stop her physically. Stopping her physically in a mining camp in the middle of the night with consequence that would not serve him. And he was still, even now, thinking about consequence. This changes nothing," he said to her back. She stopped. She turned. "It changes everything," she said. "You came here tonight with 9 men and a plan. You have 4 men and no plan. And you still think this is a negotiation." Garrett looked at her. "It's always a negotiation," he said. "Not tonight," Hattie said. She turned back toward the tree line, and Eli Cross walked out of it. He had come down from the ridge after the professionals' retreat, moving through the forest on a line he had walked a dozen times in preparation for exactly this moment. He had crossed the lower meadow, circled the deadfall on the south slope, come into the mining camp clearing from the west, not from the direction Garrett was watching. He walked into the firelight from the camp torches. He carried the Hawken across his forearm. He walked until he was 20 feet from Garrett. He stopped. The 2 men who had spent 9 years in each other's orbits, first as partners, then as ghosts of each other's worst decisions, finally as adversaries, stood in the firelight of a ruined mining camp in the Colorado mountains in a cold November night and looked at each other. Garrett's 3 remaining men looked at the tree line. The tree line had lights in it, not many, but enough. Walt Fenner's lantern, Pete Halverson's, the Morrison brothers. The others, who had come up the trail and circled Oost when Eli's movement had been the signal to do so. Garrett took in the lights. He took in Hattie Cole, standing clear of the shack with her medical bag and her composed expression. He took in Eli Cross, standing 20 feet away with the Hawken and the stillness of a man who has spent 6 years preparing for a moment and has finally arrived at it and is not. It turns out, in any hurry. "You can't simply," Garrett began. "I want you to hear something," Eli said. Garrett stopped. Ellie reached into his coat. He took out the oilcloth roll, the second copy, the one he always kept on his body. He unrolled it. He held it up in the firelight. "The Celestial Star Geological Survey," he said. 1867. Your handwriting in the margins. The geological risk notation for high collapse formations. The same notation you made for Harrow Basin and the same survey period. He let Garrett look at it. "This goes to the territorial court in Denver. It has already been described in a letter. That left Copper Creek on this morning's stage." He paused. "There is also a witness, a man who was at Harrow Basin in the weeks before the collapse, who heard the conversation in the management office, who has agreed to provide a sworn statement." Garrett's expression did not change on the surface. Below the surface, something was happening. Firelight, that the firelight was just sufficient to catch. A kind of diminishing. The particular diminishing of a man watching the architecture of a long-maintained position begin to fail. "You can't prove," he started. "I don't have to prove anything tonight," Eli said. "The attorney in Denver will do that work. What I am telling you tonight is that the proof exists. It is already in motion, and nothing you do in the next 5 minutes changes that." Garrett looked at the document. He looked at the tree line. He looked at Hattie Cole. He looked at the 3 men standing behind him, men who were recalculating, who were doing the arithmetic of association and consequence, and arriving at conclusions that were not favorable to their current employer. "What do you want?" Garrett said. I want you to ride out of this valley, Eli said. Tonight. I want the land purchases you've made in the past 6 weeks voided. All of them. The families who sold under duress get their land back. He paused. And I want you to never come back here. Garrett's jaw tightened. And if I don't, he said. Ellie looked at him steadily. Then you stand here until morning and explain yourself to the territorial marshal, who was notified by telegraph from Salida 2 days ago and is currently on the road from Silverton. He let that land. Your choice. Garrett stood very still. The fire popped. An iron bell rang once in the pines above the camp. Not a warning, just the wind moving through it. One clear note. Then silence. Garrett looked at Eli Cross for a long time. At the man who had stood in a management office 9 years ago and not done enough. At the man who had spent 6 years on a mountain carrying the weight of that had come back down. Not with a rifle and a grudge, but with a document in a community and the specific kind of Padian-Seth that belongs to people who have decided to do a thing correctly. Something went out of Garrett's face. Not remorse. He did not expect remorse, but the quality of certainty that had animated every expression he had ever worn. That went out. What replaced it was something older and simpler, calculation without options. He turned to his horse. He mounted. He did not speak to his 3 men. He did not speak to Eli. He did not look at Hattie. He rode south out of the mining camp, clearing into the dark. Toward the valley road, his 3 men looked at each other. They looked at the tree line, at Eli, at Hattie. They rode after Garrett. The sound of the horses faded. The clearing was quiet. Eli stood in the firelight with the document in his hands and the Hawkana across his forearm and the specific quality volume of stillness that follows a held breath. Released, Hattie walked to him. She stood beside him and looked at the direction Garrett had gone. He won't make it to the main road, she said. No, Eli said. She looked at him. The marshal, she said. 2 miles south, Eli said. May sent the telegraph 4 days ago. I didn't want to say it in the room in case someone talked. He paused. I'm sorry. I didn't tell you. She was quiet for a moment. Next time she said, tell me. Yes, he said. The Morrison brothers came out of the tree line, followed by Pete and Walt and the others. They moved into the firelight with the careful, slightly dazed expression of people who had done a difficult thing and were in the process of understanding that they had done it. Nobody spoke for a moment. Walt Fenner set his lantern down on a timber. He set his sharps against the same timber. He looked at the fire. He said, to no one in particular, well, which was sufficient. The marshal's name was Davidson. He arrived at the southern edge of the valley an hour before dawn with 4 deputies, and the particular expression of a law officer who had been given accurate information in advance, and had organized himself accordingly. Garrett was on the road, 2 miles south of the mining camp. When Davidson intercepted him, the 3 men who had ridden with Garrett were released after questioning. They had no meaningful connection to anything. Davidson needed to investigate. Their employer had bigger problems than their testimony could address. Garrett was taken to Silverton. The territorial attorney in Denver received May Sutton's letter on a Friday. By the following Monday, the Harrow Basin inquiry had been formally reopened. Tucker Hayes had left Copper Creek on the afternoon of the confrontation, heading south on the main road. He had passed Davidson's party coming north. He had pulled off the road and let them pass. Then he had turned around. He arrived at the marshal's camp outside Silverton 3 days later. He did not arrive reluctantly. He arrived with a written statement already prepared in his own hand, describing in precise and unsparing detail the events of the winter of 1867 at Harrow Basin, the conversation in the management office, the work order, what he had seen and what he had been told and what he had done, and not done the weeks before the collapse. He had been carrying that statement for 6 years. He had written it the same year Eli had written his letter. Neither of them had known about the other. 3 days. After the confrontation, Ellie went to the clinic. He came in the afternoon, through the front door, at a reasonable hour, without ash on his coat. He had also, for the first times anyone in Copper Creek could recall, done something about his beard. Not entirely, but enough that he looked less like the mountain had assembled him from available materials, and more like a man who had made a deliberate decision about his own appearance. Hattie noticed. She said nothing about it, which was how she handled things she found significant. She was restocking the cedar box when he came in. She looked up. She looked at him. She looked back at the cedar box. "How is the cabin?" she said. "Standing," he said. She set an instrument in the box. "And the upper creek?" "Clearing," he said. "Give it a month. It'll be clean again." She closed the box. She reached into her apron pocket. She took out something small and set it on the examination table between them. It was a compass, brass old, the kind of instrument manufactured in the East that had traveled a long way to get here. The glass face was cracked. A long diagonal fracture from upper left to lower right, sealed with a thin line of dried resinto, keep the moisture out. The needle still moved freely. The cardinal markings were still legible under the cracked glass. Eli looked at it. "James carried this," Hattie said. "He used it to find his way when he got turned around, which happened more than he liked to admit." She paused. "I've carried it since he died, in this bag, every day." She looked at the compass. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told him. "About not wanting to be the only person carrying something. About how heavy it gets." He looked at her. "I've been carrying this for 3 years," she said. "Not because I needed it. Because setting it down felt like letting something go. That I wasn't sure I was allowed to let go." She paused. "I've been wrong about that." She pushed the compass across the table toward him. He looked at the cracked glass and the steady needle in the worn brass casing that had been in someone's pocket through years. He hadn't been present for. "It still works," she said. The crack doesn't affect the needle." He picked it up. He held it in his palm, felt the weight of it, lighter than it looked. The way brass always was. "The needle settled north, Hattie," he said. She waited. "I told you I'd show you the cabin," he said. "You did," she said. "I'd like to do that," he said. "If you're still willing." She looked at him across the examination table, at the worn coat and the steady eyes, and the hands that held a cracked compass with the same care they brought to everything they held. "I'm still willing," she said. He closed his hand around the compass. He put it in his coat pocket. She picked up her medical bag. They walked out of the clinic together, into the November afternoon, into the particular light of a high Colorado valley at the end of autumn, thin and cold and clear. The kind of light that showed everything exactly as it was, without flattery or softening. The street was quiet. Walt Fenner was sweeping the trading post steps. He looked up when they passed. He looked at them. Together, walking north, which was the direction of the mountain trail. He looked at his broom. He resumed sweeping. May Sutton was at the way station window. She watched them pass with the expression of a woman whose opinions had been consistently correct and who found no particular need to say so. Danny Pruitt was sitting on the livery fence. He watched them go. "Where are you going?" he called. Ellie looked at him. "Up," he said. Danny seemed to consider whether this was sufficient information. He decided it was. They walked to the north end of the street, where the road ended and the trail began, winding up through the scrub oaken to the lower pines. The trail through the cathedral was everything. Eli had walked it to beat this time of day. In this light, the old firs rose clean and straight on both sides. The low November sun came in at an angle that caught the upper bark and lit it amber. The ground was frozen and quiet underfoot. Their breath was visible in the cold air. Hattie did not speak for a long time. Neither did Eli. They walked in the cathedral silence, which was not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had said enough for the moment and were comfortable with the rest. Halfway up the main switchback, Hattie stopped. She was looking out through a gap in the trees, a natural break in the canopy offering as line of sight back down the valley. Copper Creek was visible from here, in its modest east-west line, the buildings small in the afternoon light, the smoke from May's way station chimney bending southwest in the wind. "I can see the clinic from here," she said. "Yes," Eli said. She looked at it. "You could see it from the trail," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. She turned and looked at him. "All those years," she said, "I saw the light in the window," he said. "The first time I noticed it. You were working late, past midnight. The light was on." He paused. "After that, I noticed it every time I came down the mountain at night." She held his gaze. "Did it help?" she said, "seeing it?" He looked at the clinic window, small and distant below them. "Yes," he said. She turned back to the trail. "Come on, then," she said. "Show me this cabin." They reached Widow's Peak an hour before dark. The cabin sat in its hollow below the main ridge exactly as it was. Low roof, log built, the sawed roof thick with the first dusting of early snow, the lean-to on the north side with its organized equipment, the woodpile, diminished from the fires, but still substantial, the east-facing aspect that caught the morning light. First helt longest, and Hattie stood in the clearing and looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. "You built this yourself," she said. "Yes," he said. "All of it? All of it?" She walked to the door. She put her hand on the frame, on the way it was fitted, the precision of the hewn corner joint, the way the timber had been selected for straightness and density. She was reading it, the way she read everything, with her hands, with her attention, with the professional assessment of someone who understood that quality of construction was a language. "Come inside," he said. She came inside. The cabin was exactly what it was. One room, one bunk, one table, one iron stove, the Hawken on its pegs, the Winchester in the corner, the 3 steel traps on the rafter, the shelf with its small inventory of necessary things. As on the shelf in the corner, a row of carved wooden figures, small, animals mostly, an elk rendered with such precision that the individual muscles of the shoulder were visible, a bear, 2 deer, a great horned owl, a mountain lion in the particular low crouch of an animal about to move, a rabbit mid-leap, and at the end of the row, set apart from the animals, new enough that the wood still showed the knife marks at close inspection, a figure of a woman, standing straight, a bag over one shoulder, the posture of someone who moved with deliberate economy. Hattie went to the shelf. She stood in front of the row of figures. She looked at each of them, the animals, and then the figure at the end. She picked it up. She turned it in her hands. She ran her thumb along the carved shoulder, along the small carved bag, along the straight carved spine. Of a woman who did not lean and did not apologize for standing where she stood. She held it for a long time. "When did you make this?" she said. 3 nights ago, he said. She looked at him. "You had never carved a person before," she said. "No," he said. She looked at the figure again. "Why now?" she said. He looked at the shelf, at the row of animals he had made over 6 years of evenings alone. "Because for 6 years I carved things I could see from a distance," he said, "and then I couldn't do that anymore." She set the figure back at the end of the row. Not replacing it, placing it, the way you place something that belongs where you are putting it. She looked at the shelf for a moment longer. Then she went to the east-facing window, the one that caught the morning light. She looked out through at the valley. Belows. The last of the afternoon. Light was going out of the sky in the west. The valley was darkening from the bottom up. The ridge above them was still lit, stone catching the red edge of the sunset. The iron bell in the lower pines caught the evening wind and rang once, soft, clear, carrying. Hattie heard it. She put her hand on the window frame, looked at the valley below and the ridge, then the particular quality of the air at altitude, thinner, cleaner, more honestly cold than valley air. "I like it up here," she said. Ely was at the stove. "Building the fire good," he said. She kept her hand on the window frame and watched the valley go dark. The fire caught behind her. The warmth of it reached her back. She stayed at the window until the valley was entirely dark and the first stars appeared, brighter up here than below, the way he had told her they would be. Then she turned away from the window. She sat at the table. Ellie set a tin cup of coffee in front of her without being asked. She put both hands around it. They sat at the table in the cabin on Widow's Peak. The November dark with the fire going in the coffee, warm and the iron bell ringing occasionally in the pines below. They did not say very much. They did not need to say very much. The compass was on the table between them. She had taken it from his coat pocket when he hung it on the peg by the door. She had set it on the table where the lamplight could reach it. The cracked glass caught the light and scattered it in the particular way of broken thinks that have not stopped working. The needle pointed north, always north, steady as the mountain under them. After a long while, Hattie said, "Tell me about the first winter." He looked at the fire. It was cold, he said. She waited. He poured himself coffee. He wrapped his hands around the cup the same way she had wrapped hers. "The first winter I thought a lot about leaving," he said. "I thought about it almost every morning. The second winter I thought about it less. By the third winter I stopped thinking about it." He looked at the cup. "Not because it had gotten easier, but because I had stopped asking the question." "Which question?" she said. "Whether I deserved to be comfortable," he said. She looked at him. "And now?" she said. He looked at the fire, at the lamp, at the compass on the table, at Hattie, Cole sitting across from him, and the cabin he had built alone, a mountain he had chosen for reasons that had turned out to be more complicated than he had admitted to himself. Now he said, "I think that was the wrong question." She held his eyes. "What's the right question?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Whether I'm going to do something with whatever is left," he said. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the mountain wind came around the ridge, not as a warning, not as something to be endured, just wind. The sound of a place that was still here, that had always been here, that would be here considerably longer than either of them. She reached across the table. She put her hand over Histaway. He had put his hand over Herson. May's back room. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a long time, with the fire burning and the stars outside and the iron bells in the pines below ringing their soft, irregular musicking. The November dark. Later she slept on the bunk. He kept watch by the dying fire the way he had always kept watch in the mountain. Dark went through its hours the way mountain dark always did, complete, without reference to human opinion. He sat in the old chair he had built in his first winter, and he looked at the compass on the table, at the cracked glass and the steady needle, at the lamp burning low. He was not thinking about Garrett. He was not thinking about Harrow Basin. He was not thinking about the letter that was already in Denver, the inquiry that was already reopened at her, the long legal process that would take years and would not bring anyone back but would at least mean that what had happened was on the recording, in a place that could not be bought or misfiled. He was thinking about the morning, about the east-facing window. about what the light would look like, coming through it, with someone else in the room. He was still sitting there when the first gray light came over the eastern ridge. He put wood on the fire. He put the coffee on, and he sat back down, and he waited for the morning, the way a man waits. When he has somewhere to be in, the somewhere is here. Spring came to the valley that year with the particular thoroughness of spring, following a hard winter, insistent, generous, slightly aggressive about it. The snow came off the high meadows in April. The creek ran high and clear. The lower pastures went green so fast, you could almost watch it happening. Walt Fenner opened his trading post windows for the first time since October and stood in the doorway and let the air come in. Things had changed, not dramatically, not in the way of a place that had experienced some great upheaval and rebuilt itself from nothing. The change was quieter than that. It was the change of a community that had been frightened and had found out was not as alone as it had believed. The Halversons' family was back. Their land had been returned under the terms of the agreement that preceded Garrett's arrest, terms the territorial court had seen fit to enforce with unusual promptness, given the nature of the accompanying evidence. The Morrison widow kept her property. The families who had sold under duress had their purchases voided. The clinic had a new examination room. Stone foundation, cedar frame, east-facing windows that let the morning light in first. Danny Pruett's father had done the framing. Walt Fenner had supplied the materials at cost. Eli Cross had done the foundation work in the window joiner. And a carved wooden sign above the door that read, simply, Cole, Medical. The sign was plain and correct and made to last. May Sutton's way station had a new roof. She had not asked for it. She had simply found it done one morning in February, while there was still snow on the ground. She had spent several days attempting to identify the responsible party. Before deciding, she already knew, and did not require confirmation. In the evenings, when the last travelers had gone, and the mail was sorted, and the stove was burning low, May would sometimes sit at the front window and look up toward the ridge. There was a light on the mountain now. The cabin on Widow's Peak had always been there, but the light had been intermittent before, present some nights, absent others, the uncertain light of a man who spent more time in darkness than he required. Now it burned steadily, most evenings, 2 lamps, the warm yellow of a room being used by more than one person. May would look at that light sometimes, and then look back at whatever she was doing, and say nothing about it to anyone. On a May evening, 3 men were sitting in Walt Fenner's trading post after closing. Walt and Pete Halverson and a cattle buyer who had come through on the stage and decided to stay an extra day because the coffee was good and the conversation was better than he had found elsewhere. The cattle buyer had been asking about the valley, about the trouble the previous autumn, about the man on the mountain. He had heard versions of the story in 3 different towns on his way north, each version somewhat different from the others, each version growing in the telling, the number of Garrettception, the nature of the confrontation, the way stories grew. What actually happened? The cattle buyer asked. Walt poured himself more coffee. He looked at the cup. He was quiet for long enough that the cattle buyer wondered whether the question had been unwelcome. Then Walt said, "You want to know about Eli Cross? If that's the heart of it?" The cattle buyer said. Walt set the coffee pot down. "Here is what most people don't know," Walt said, "and I only know it because I spent the autumn putting things together that I should have noticed earlier." He folded his hands on the counter. "That man came into this valley twice a year for 4 years. He spoke to nobody. He bought his supplies and left. Every person in Copper Creek thought he was exactly what he looked like. A mountain man who had gone wild, who wanted nothing to do with human company. Pete Halverson was nodding slowly. But here is the thing, Walt said. In those 4 years, fences got mended, roofs got repaired, animals that should have died of illness recovered. Children who got lost in the upper meadows found their way home by trail that had been cleared and marked at some point. Nobody could remember. He paused. My own roof, Hattie Cole's roof, 3 others I know of, personally. The work was done in the dark, before anyone was awake, with no name attached to it. The cattle buyer was listening carefully. 2 weeks before everything came to a head, Walt said, Eli Cross came down from that mountain and told 6 familiars that he needed them in the East Pines at midnight. He told me where to stand. He gave us all specific positions. Walt looked at his hands. He had been planning it for 2 weeks. He knew exactly how Garrett's men would move because he had been watching them for weeks before that. He had mapped their habits, their routes, their timing. He paused. He set wire in the trails. He hung iron bells in the trees. He arranged things so that 9 armed professionals walked into a forest that was entirely prepared against them. Pete Halverson looked at the table. He never told us any of that, Pete said. Not then, not even after. No, Walt said, he didn't. The cattle buyer leaned forward. Why not? He said. Walt was quiet for a moment, because if he had told us what he was doing, Walt said, we would have been nervous. We would have known too much and worried too much, and some of us would have talked, and some of us would have hesitated, and the whole thing would have been different. He looked at the cattle buyer. He needed us there, and he needed us calm. So he told us only what we needed to know, and let us believe we were doing something simple. He picked up his coffee. That's not something you do to people. That's something you do for people. When you understand them, well, and ought to know what they can carry and what they can't. The cattle buyer sat back. He knew this community, he said. He knew this community, Walt said, better than most of us knew each other. He had been learning it for 4 years from the outside, from the mountain, from the particular distance of a man who wasn't ready to be part of something, but couldn't stop himself from caring about it. Pete Halverson smiled at that, a small smile, the kind that comes from recognizing something true. The fire in the trading post stove burned steadily outside. Through the open window, the May air came in with the particular quality of a Colorado spring evening, cool, clean, carrying the smell of the pines above the valley and the creek running high below from up the mountain, very faintly, the sound of an iron bell. Just once, the wind moving through the trees above Widow's Peak. Walt Fenner heard it. He looked at the window. He looked at the light on the mountain, the warm, steady yell of a cabin, where the lamps were burning and someone was home. He looked back at his coffee. He came down from that mountain. Walt said, because the mountain had finished what it needed to do to him, or he had finished what he needed to do on it. One way or another, he drank. Difference between those two things. Is the whole store to be? Really, he set the cup down. More coffee? He said. On Widow's Peak, in the last of the May evening light, the cabin sat in its hollow, below the ridged way it had always sat, low-roofed, log-built, the east-facing window catching the last of the light. Inside, at the table, 2 people sat with their supper. The shelf held the carved animals, and at the end of the row, the figure of a woman with a bag over her shoulder, rendered with the same precise attention, the maker brought to everything. On the windowsill, a cracked brass compass, the needle pointing north, in the pines below the cabin. The iron bell rings once more in the evening wind. Not a warning, not a signal. Just the sound of a mountain had someone living on it who intended to stay. That spring, for the first time since anyone in Copper Creek could remember, the smoke from the cabin on Widow's Peak did not go out before morning. It burned all night. And it was still burning when the sun came up. The light came through the east-facing window, the way Eli had always known. It would early, one, unhurried, the way good things come when you have finally stopped running from the place they were always going to find you.